This is a talk on the genre of epic and the activity of epicizing. It asserts that epics are a biological response to the emergence of a system of civilizations. The people who live in polities beyond the civilization system, and these are the people we're in the first instance concerned with, find themselves in a situation analogous to that of the species Canis familiaris, dogs, the domesticated symbionts of the species Homo sapiens. They feel compelled to shout out the fact that they exist. Short explanation. The appearance of juvenile characteristics in a species, pedomorphosis, is a commonplace of domestication. The dogs have undergone an evolution whereby the yelping of the cubs of the dog's ancestor, the wolf, has morphed into an attention-getting barking. Our contention is that the corresponding activity in humans is cursing. The cursing functions as an attention-getting device and a big noting of self-identity, and more generally, a big noting of cultural identity. The grandstanding curse bark has, however, only limited utility, and humans have gone well beyond dogs by overlaying some initial cursing with many comported elaborations. These comportments address a shifting agenda for domestication in civilized humans. The comporting process involves embedding the cursing material into certain special situations material, first of a complaining, moralizing kind, and then later of a purely ironic kind. This agglomerative epicizing process can be seen as both a symptom of and a solution for the evolving problem of trying to get by as a juvenile symbiont in a world of ballooning populations and socio-political complexity, a world of each man his own self-promoting outsider. This talk was first given on the 9th of November 2016 and is being given today, the 5th of February 2019. What is epic and epicizing? Is epic just another genre? Introduction. A primary purpose for the use of language in our species was, very probably, the accurate communication of states of affairs in our immediate vicinity and of immediate concern to us in our day-to-day living. So, this is a piece of wood from which we can make a spear. You've got a lot of fish and I've got a lot of fruit. Why don't we exchange a small amount of fish and fruit in a trade deal, etc. In short, language, which is to say an abstractive system of describing the world and the actions in it through vocal croaks, started out as an aid to cooperative living. However, as cooperative systems burgeoned into full-blown civilizations, another purpose was found for language. Variously, handling conspecifics beyond the horizon of the civilized precinct and for responding to the, quotes, threat of a monolithic civilized precinct. A precinct beyond where you're living. These new, if I may so call them, epiphenomena of domestication were the proto-religious utterances curses. In a behaviour directly analogous to that of a dog that barks in its domesticated impotence, humans, now having to lower their aggression for the conditions of cooperative civilized life, have developed a literary barking and snarling which has galvanized their identity as being either inside or, more particularly, outside and beyond a cooperative monumentalism. In this talk, we propose to show that epic, far from being just another genre, is that specific adaptive use of or appropriation of rational language in order to launch, or perhaps to revive and thereby maintain, a coherent cultural identity. This is achieved in the first instance by a cursing of the cultural opposition. The cursing, however, only gets the epic started, and later, after some military action that rather inevitably results from the cursing, the text turns towards moralizing and rationalizing, and then the more purely ironic concerns of a person living in an advanced polity where the hot language is the exact opposite of their communication needs. To explain how all this works, we will need to briefly travel through some important theoretics for life on this planet. 1, how eyes and brains work. 2, why dogs bark. 3, how genre works. And 4, the idea of exaptation in biology. So bear with me whilst we do some trawling. Theoretic 1, how do eyes and brains work? For some time now, we've known that the world that presents itself in our visual field was not all put there by a real external world. Only a fraction of what is in front of us is being seen by us in the direct way proposed by the empiricist philosophers of the past. An area as small as a fingernail at arm's length has been proposed as the amount we actually see. The rest is being put there by our brains. This added in material is an amalgam of memories, expectations, and pre-existing formulas. And according to a recent documentary, the brain supplies 6 times more input for our perceptions than the outside world. To just quickly explain here, I am in a room. I have been inside many rooms. They are all much alike. They are boxes or elongated boxes. So I'm not going to expend any great energy to examine the no doubt eccentric features of this particular room. I'm going to consider it to be a regular, generic, pre-existing in my head type of room. In other words, most of what is perceived is typical structure. In perception, types are of the essence. All this is, of course, shockingly counterintuitive because each of us feels, like Descartes' happy with the accuracy of his own senses man, that they are directly observing an objective reality. But let's just go with the egghead scientist for the moment and move on to the momentous corollary to this, a corollary with regard to cultural tradition. In our Western tradition, God kicked off reality by dividing time into 7 parts. And, apparently taking our cue from heaven, we've decided to divide up time likewise into 7 parts, with a 7-day week, with the first 6 parts designed to be business as usual, and the final part to be a period in which we are supposed to be physically inert and to take our noses away from reality and gaze upon a higher plane. That theoretical higher plane where higher planning and broader destinies are contemplated. To be a bit more explicit, for 6/7 of the time, we can go about our animal lives with our cartloads of unexamined pre-existing conceptions and instinctual reactions, but for 1/7 of the time, we are enjoined to ponder higher and more abstract realities, including, and notably, restraining and constraining ideas about our animal behaviour, such as laws and curses, but also some compensating ones, blessings. So as peculiar as it may seem to a modern secular era, religion was originally a proto-science, which helped us to contemplate the world in a more abstract way. Religion may have deprived us of our, quotes, normal reactions to the world, but it has had the partially intended consequence of getting us to become disinterested observers of it. Religion effectively handed us the modern world. It is the seeming poison of modern, super-cooperative, domesticated, civilized life which has allowed us some degree of contact with a world governed by eternal laws, a world not especially engaged with human preoccupation and points of view. Now, whilst all that is very interesting as cultural background, and I think it does help us to understand where our scientific conceptualizing comes from, it's not quite our actual concern today. What we are really drawing your attention to here is that in cultural development, point number one, 86% of the ideas have to be pre-existing. And point number two, as stories are told over and over, the successive writers and redactors are subject to what we might call a 14% rule. Each poet or redaction committee has a 14% stretch of text available as a window of opportunity to screw the material onto what he or they, quotes, really want to say, or what the audience, quotes, really needs to hear. As the comparatively small amount of extra material is added in, and as the editing wrenches the text into a more and more distorted form, a sort of principle of diminishing returns comes into play, and the text attains a final form, presumably to avoid outright unintelligibility. So it is that a large core of heterogeneous material coagulates into one curious lump, a lump containing a mass of embedded narratives embellished by a revealingly editorializing and resequencing. In summary on Theoretic 1, developments in neuropsychology help us to understand what it is that a cultural tradition has both a monolithic and an agglomerative quality. If culture could be imagined to be an eye and a brain operating over a vast period, it would, as a matter of course, produce an epic object. Theoretic 2, why dogs bark. We need to begin here by saying what a dog is. The big experts on dogs tell us that the modern dog is a domesticated wolf. And like most domesticated species, it exhibits pedomorphic traits, so neotenous or juvenile traits. Some of these are luxurious fur, white patches of fur, coloured coats and hides, floppy and overly large ears, small jaws, teeth and brains, juvenile faces, lighter frames and small adrenal glands, which makes the animal generally less fearful. But only one trait directly concerns us today, and that is the vocalization, barking. The wolf cubs yelp for attention from the older members of the pack. Generally, the adult wolves don't yelp. Although, somewhat intriguingly for what we are arguing, the lone wolf, a wolf for some reason adrift from the pack, howls for adult attention. The general view is that the modern dog has, with barking, not only prolonged its yelping behaviour into adult life, but has cultivated it into a lifelong activity of demanding attention. So, big question, what is a dog saying with barking? Well, before we launch into this, we'd be wise to conjecture what the yelps mean for the wolf cubs. I've proposed in my previous talk something like a principle in biology that goes, if you can't be big, look big. The young of many creatures use noise to raise their own profile. They yelp, they chirp, they bawl to tell the world that, what? It is completely unfair that this small and vulnerable creature should be so small and vulnerable. That is probably what they would say if they could speak English, and is probably what a shrieking human infant means. Or maybe, more philosophically, I make noise, therefore I am. Most often it means, please feed me or you'll never have a moment's peace again in your life. With our modern domesticated dog, barking has moved off into a slightly more precise domain of communication. The domain, the domain of adult noises, the domain of making threats. To be sure, the dog will still bark with the original purpose of attracting attention from, say, its owner, although in my experience, never for food. A dog, however, seems to bark at, for instance, other dogs to communicate two different messages. One is, if you are smaller and less powerful than me, or are easily intimidated, come here so that I can dominate you. And two, if you are bigger and more powerful than me, go away, because I am a crazy and impressively healthy canine who just might cause you an injury if you're not permanently on your guard. This explanation of barking as effectively an all-purpose gigantic bluff may still seem to us a little unconvincing, especially when we sit and listen to a dog bark for, say, 20 minutes or longer and think, what possible payoff could there be for that level of expenditure of energy? A clue to why it really is the answer may have been afforded to us in a recent study on bees, known popularly as How Bees Communicate: Whispers to Friends, Shouts to Enemies, 2014. In this study of bees, bees familiar to us, eusocial bees, it was found that certain bees do communicate pheromonically at a low level to each other about the status of, say, a floral source, but that when they are actually at the source, they blast out information telling any conspecifics that happen to pass that they have colonized this area, even or especially if the colonizing numbers are low. The extreme importance of the capital BB, big bluff, tactic can be seen clearly in this. The obtaining of new floral sources for big bee colonies is critical for survival, but their numbers will always be limited at an initial stage of moving into new areas. So by way of pheromonic noise, they try to convince any would-be competitors that they have more troops present than are actually available. Noise is of the essence in this game. This strategy works because bee wars for territory will cause thousands or even tens of thousands of deaths, and consequently potential rivals only rarely call the loud incumbents bluff. This, I think, helps us to understand why dogs imagine making noise is so important. They don't have much territory to defend, say a backyard, and only possess 1, 2, or 4 owners, if their owners can be regarded as their possessions. So, from the dog's point of view, their incumbency is tenuous and permanently tenuous. Therefore, whilst it might be a matter of amusement or annoyance to us, a bluffing bark for the domestic dog may make a good deal of evolutionary sense. So barking is an adaptation in a species that has become a domesticated one that, crucially for what we're saying today, has started to live in a symbiotic relationship with its dominant species, i.e. Homo sapiens. What we are seeing in dog domestication has a striking significance for our own species. The outsider symbiont adopts not only the, quotes, childish behaviour of playful vocalising, but also, quotes, dramatic behaviour, as domestication starts to emerge in trainee cooperators. So, theoretic 2. Dogs, a species of domesticated to-be companions for humans, bark as a specialised development of the yelping of young wolves. They do this in order to proclaim their existence or their incumbency or their priority, and they do it in a context where their peripherality is all a bit painfully obvious. Not to the animals being signalled, but to a scientist. Theoretic 3. Genre and genre analysis. Agatha Christie's The Body in the Library. Genre in literature is a type of writing that has certain fixed elements. Examples of genre are street sign, washing machine manual, historical romance, murder mystery, gospel, tragedy, comedy and fantasy. Later on we'll be saying something about whether epic is just another one of those genres. For now, we are concentrating on how these non-epic genres work. In English, one is told that you write in a genre. And the purpose of this theoretic is to tell you that this use of an innocent English preposition is most unfortunate and a perennial source of confusion. You would be far better off saying that someone wrote on a genre, meaning that they wrote on top of a genre, but also, and note particularly, that other use of on the topic of. To just explain this briefly, you write on top of a genre. Here's the genre. You're writing on top. Large amounts of your material are there already for you. You just come in and recast the material, use your own setting, change the characters slightly, focus more closely on some particular symbol or some particular ethical question or some particular character defect. But also you write on the topic of the genre by making some sort of commentary on the usual features of the type of writing. So for instance, you say, I'm going to introduce a completely new type of hero, one that departs from all the ones my readers are used to. In the same way that you can't just write in a language of your own devising, with apologies to the advocates of Esperanto and Volapük, likewise you can't write in a genre of your own devising, although you can try and very likely be acclaimed a literary genius if you succeed. Think Joyce, Kafka, Beckett. But for the most part you can't. And the reason is furnished for us by theoretic 1. You have to work with that material and those structures that are already lodged in people's heads. Let's see all this in action in a work by the third most published entity in all history, Agatha Christie. The order, in case you're wondering, goes Bible, Shakespeare, then Christie. And they are a long way clear of the rest. The book is Agatha Christie's The Body in the Library, 1942. But probably written well before that. Somewhat unusually, Christie supplies a preface for this book, and it constitutes a very big free kick for our purposes. The preface begins, there are certain cliches belonging to certain types of fiction. The bold, bad baronet for melodrama, the body in the library for the detective story. For several years, I treasured up the possibility of a suitable variation on a theme. I laid down for myself certain conditions. The library in question must be a highly orthodox and conventional library. The body, on the other hand, must be a wildly improbable and highly sensational body. So here we have that most arresting literary moment where in the text and a fortiori right at the beginning of it, you are told that the author has genre on their mind as a guiding preoccupation. The text of the book proper takes up, right at the outset, certain genre questions. In particular, what is detection? Or how do you know you've detected something? A woman in a large country house, only half awake and still dreaming, realizes that the usual early morning household noises are not quite what they should be. And whilst she's noticing, or half noticing, a distressed maid rushes into the bedroom and announces that a body has been found in the library. The woman nudges her still sleeping aristocrat magistrate husband, who is a while waking up and taking in the news. He then says, "You've been dreaming, Dolly. That's what it is. It's that detective story you were reading. The clue of the broken match. You know, Lord Edgbaston finds a beautiful blonde dead on the library hearthrug. Bodies are always being found in libraries and books. I've never known a case in real life. Pages 12, 13. So the whole beginning of the book is, as we've come to say, metafictional. But let's be a bit more specific and call it metageneric. And Christie's point seems to be that coming to consciousness is a bit like finding a body in your library. You are noticing an anomalous, shocking detail in an otherwise immobile, tradition strangled, convention strangled, habit strangled, everyday world. It's fundamental and structural for crime fiction, and it's fundamental and structural for human intelligence. In the rest of the book, questions of what is detection and who's doing it continue to be raised. Let's just pick out one strand of this genre commentary. The fact that there are way too many detectives. According to my count, there are a staggering 12 characters connected in some way to the business of detection. Of these, 4 are professional detectives, 2 local detectives from different counties, a chief constable of a county, and a former commissioner of the Metropolitan, i.e. London Police. Then, number 5, a doctor who is, quotes, a police surgeon, page 24. 6, there is a suspect who is the generous patron of police sports and principal magistrate of the district, page 15. 7, there is an ordinary constable who establishes his extreme ordinariness by answering the phone saying, and I'm not making this up, hello, 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 page 15. 8, there is a 9-year-old boy who avidly reads crime fiction and does some sleuthing of his own out of sheer curiosity and finds a significant clue, page 88. 9, there is the wife of the first suspect who thinks crime fiction is a thrill, page 19, and who invites into the story, 10, her friend and super amateur sleuth, Miss Jane Marple, and gets her to go to the seaside to continue their investigations together. 11, there is a wealthy, wheelchair-bound, but otherwise vigorous man who declares that if he were able-bodied, he would be going around asking the questions, that he would be up, out of his wheelchair, and doing the investigations himself. Page 125. And finally, 12, there is a local sergeant who specialises in investigating car cases. Page 159. With this latter, as with the hello, hello, hello constable, Christie seems to be pulling our leg. The first is a joke about stereotypes. The second, a joke about the modern mania for specialising. Now, there are logical reasons for having different investigators, different casts of mind, different interviewing techniques. It obviates, for instance, having the same person asking every suspect, and where were you between the hours of X and Y? But Christie's over-the-top use of widely varying mental types and points of view with her 12 detectives on the problem of what eventually emerges as 2 related murders seems to have quite a different purpose, a philosophical and socio-political purpose. What is detection? Who detects in society? Is it a closed shop? The answers are ones suitable for the liberal democracies of the 20th century. Detection can be carried on by anyone. And different perspectives help additively. The democratizing, of course, constitutes a substantial undermining of the typical genre staple for murder mystery, namely that the solution should be supplied by the genius hero detective. But this is not all. In Christie's Miss Marple books, there is an unmistakable incipient feminist viewpoint, a relentless chipping away at the genre superstructure of single genius outsider male sleuths and the unquestioned prestige of male authority figures. In The Body in the Library, dumb figures of male authority, the first of the two county detectives, Inspector Slack, seems to bear the weight of Christie's attack, are blind to some bleedingly obvious clues, such as the chewed nails, the nail clippings, the type of dress worn by the first murder victim, and some other more nuanced ones, such as how married couples speak to one another. So the usual business of a murder mystery novel has here an overlaying of commentary on detection and authority. And something else contributes to the commentary. The single amateur detective, Marple, against her type of super knowledgeable, super observant uncoverer of mysteries, and despite having a sort of one-woman cheer squad, the magistrate's wife, who was arranging transport for her, urging her on and telling her how great she is, says at 2 points in the novel that she doesn't really have any idea what's going on with the two murders, and only gets to a point where she can put together a plausible chain of events with the help of all the other investigative minds, and by setting a trap with the unlikely help of the wheelchair-bound man. And so, genre subversion at every turn. And add to this that in the Agatha Christie canon, there is a book where almost all the suspects commit the murder, a book where there is no detective at all, and all the suspects die, and a novel super extraordinarily where Poirot commits a murder. And you can see that, as is often the case with a significant writer, there is a move towards stretching the genre, turning it every which way in order to make comments about philosophical and abstract matters. Matters such as authority, clear thinking, evil, and justice. In summary on Theoretic 3, the best way of understanding genre is that there is an avalanche of pre-existing traditional material out on what Nabokov has called the lexical playing fields. And all writers are fencing off part of the quotes fields, some particular area of traditional thinking and traditional structures, and writing their own concerns onto them. Expert writers threaten to take over a whole field for themselves by taking over the turf, the goalpost, the referees and the players and making them all their own. Christie's Body in the Library shows this deft literary ability in action. She already knows how to write the competent murder mystery, but at a certain point that is just simply not enough. And so here she wants to write herself and her concerns into the library of literature by being part of the commentary on our usual modes of thought. She's not entirely cracking a joke when she has the 9-year-old Peter Carmody reveal that he has the signatures of 4 famous murder mystery writers, and one of them is Christie's own. Page 88. You might say she's angling to put her body in the library. In this life, you're very unlikely to convince anybody of anything very important. So insinuation of your views and your necessarily individual personal identity seems to be something of a spiritual imperative. As Samuel Beckett, the most metafictional writer of them all, puts it, now it's time to speak about me. Theoretic 4, acceptation. In this talk, we are focusing on the specific phenomenon of epic, but what we will be describing can come under a much larger heading, acceptation. The biologist Stephen Gould brought this concept to the world of science some time ago, but the world of science hasn't paid much attention. For why this topic need concern us, see my previous talk, The Tendency Towards a Clear Signalling Monumentalism, the case of epic. Just for the moment, all we need to highlight is that the idea of using older forms for new purposes is fundamental to understanding literature and art as a whole. As a species becomes aware of a crowded marketplace of curses, threats, counter-threats, and counter considerations that go to make up a mature biological terrain, it also realizes that a much leaner, coded method for communication is not only desirable, but is in fact essential. Use of forms that are, quotes, emptied out, rid of their virulence, but in Gould's terminology, jury-built, not apparently to be confused with the pejorative jerry-built and meaning built for purpose or built to solve a problem, become the only salvation for a species that can't productively practice intimidation. We call this emptying out process irony, and it can end up being humour, where there is, so to speak, a riot of misapplications of content in forms. But on the way to this reduction to the absurd are many interesting philosophic and scientific stations. Life as a human uniquely offers many opportunities to engage with the world around us by using the technique of accepting, using an ironizing abstraction. So much for our four theoretics. Part 1, noisy outsiders, ? Our assertion is that epics originate with a text that has a focus on noisy outsiders. Let's just check that this is actually so. Starting away from the ancient world, we can look at the case of the Star Wars franchise, which focuses on something called a rebel alliance. This rebel alliance is for all purposes just 7 entities, a ragtag coalition of dispossessed aristocrats, Luke, Leia, Obi-Wan, Kenobi, a shady opportunist, Han Solo, 2 intellectuals, CP30 and R2-D2, and representing wild nature, the Wookiee. Are they noisy? Well, the Wookiee's growls are noteworthy, but that very literal noise is not quite what we're talking about here. What we are interested in is much more the capital BT, brave talk. A continual mutually urging on of each other. For the modern moviegoers, there is, to be sure, without any delay, the introduction of irony and humour, with the reluctance of both Solo and R2-D2. But this is not central to the story, which is really about the non-ironic testing of heroes and a non-ironic galvanizing banter directed towards overthrowing a capital EE, evil empire. With the Iliad, you have the aspirant Greeks being quite literally outside the civilization at the beach and on the plain of Troy. And noise? Well, we are definitely counting a declaration of war as a curse. There is also, however, a lot of brave and self-important talk. In the Bible, with the invasion of the land of milk and honey, the sophisticated civilization of the Canaanites, you have more declarations of war from those outside the hallowed precinct. And noise? Very conveniently, the technique of blowing trumpets is an actual military strategy, if the story of Jericho is representative of the series of victories. Gilgamesh. Here things get a bit complicated, and probably because this epic comes from a time when civilization is only just establishing itself. And concomitant complication, Gilgamesh, the wild man Enkidu, and the monster Humbaba are part of the emerging system of civilization themselves. Although I suppose you could say that Humbaba was just a noise-making outsider. The first of his formula descriptions is, when he roars, it is like the torrent of the storm, page 74. But the text eventually arrives at its central issue about halfway through, which is that Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and Humbaba are mortal and are therefore outsiders. They are beyond the eternal realm of the gods. This is Gilgamesh's great revelation. The earthly powers die, and he, as 1/3 human, must also die. The text underlines this central issue with the flood story, which involves the idea that all humans are outsiders, outsiders beyond the world of the pure power of heaven, the realm inhabited by the gods. And does anyone remember why it is that in the flood story, the gods are resolved to exterminate every single human being? It has nothing to do with the Bible's moralizing explanation of the wickedness of man being great in the earth and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart being only evil continually, in the tortured English of Genesis 6:5. Humans are to be exterminated in the Utnapishtim flood story because they are making too much noise. Humans are becoming so numerous and thereby becoming so noisy that the gods can't get to sleep at night. The beginning of Book 5. Note also in Gilgamesh a rather interesting feature: degrees of outsiderness. Gilgamesh, just outside. Wildman Enkidu, only partially reconciled to the civilization. And the monster Humbaba, almost at the edge of the known world, so completely outside. But there is a further problem to be dealt with here, and that is Gilgamesh an outsider in the story? i.e. someone who is actually from outside Uruk. This topic is worth spending some time on. We are told about Gilgamesh's career up to the point of the story in a prologue and in the first paragraph of the text proper, pages 61-62. In the prologue, someone trying to make sense of world history with regard to Gilgamesh tackles the question of whether Gilgamesh came from Uruk or built it. Can you do both? In the prologue's third and final paragraph, we get to the pointy end of the problem. It starts off nice and safely. In Uruk, NB, in Uruk, he built walls, a great rampart, etc. Then comes the sophisticated and ironic wobble of a combination of adjuring imperatives. Look at it still today. And a lot of rhetorical questions, finishing with this adventurous rhetorical mixture. Climb upon the wall of Uruk, walk along it, I say. Regard the foundation terrace and examine the masonry. Is it not burnt brick and good? In other words, the author is now claiming that Gilgamesh built the city walls, without notice stating it outright. Then he finishes off on the city's origins. The 7 sages laid the foundations. This is a completion of the wobble. The foundations were built by somebody else. Actually, something else, namely the traditional civilizers of Mesopotamia, the 7 sages, 7 half-god, half-bird figures frequently depicted in Mesopotamian art. Then, at the beginning of Book 1, we get another dose of the problem. Gilgamesh went abroad in the world, but he met none who could withstand his arms, till he came to Uruk. But the men of Uruk muttered in their houses, Gilgamesh sounds the tocsin, the war alarm, for his amusement. His arrogance has no bounds by day or night. So, outsider or insider? Here he's shaping as the typical violent, hubristic outsider. In other words, the redactor actually wants you to note the paradox that the great civilizer, Gilgamesh, was in fact an outsider. And you have the same problem with Nimrod in the Bible. Did he build Babylon and all those cities in southern Mesopotamia, or was he in fact an invader from Assyria? And those cities would have had to have been there for him to invade in the first place. Part 2. In medias res. A. Do the epics start in the middle? B. Are those middles the hero's or the audience's fundamental preoccupations? C. What happens next? A. Do epics start in the middle? In the everyday world, things begin at the beginning, go through to a middle, and then finish up at an end. In epic, however, not only does this not happen, with things always beginning in the middle, but it also seems to have a rather different and astoundingly fixed trajectory of middle, later, earlier. What we are suggesting today is that the reason for this phenomenon is that epic is fundamentally what thinking is. You might like to bear in mind a quote from the handout from my previous talk from that notorious oddbod, Andy Warhol. Pop art is about liking things. People are interested in what they are interested in. In other words, their own interests are their central preoccupations. And further, it's very likely that the story which satisfies them most and which they wish to randomly broadcast to the world is how they came to power. The struggle they underwent prior to taking over. The conditions of the period when they hadn't quite made it, hadn't quite acceded to their sovereign position. Then after that come other considerations which we'll discuss in a moment. Let's first of all make sure this structure actually exists in epic, i.e., do epics really start in the middle? With Star Wars, the first film generated 2 more movies which really just continued the story of the first movie. Then there were to have been 3 sequels, but they were abandoned. However, a decision was then made to make 3 prequels, and in a next stage, just begun in this last decade, there are to be again 3 sequels. So with Star Wars, we have nearly had what occurs in antiquity. The first movie and the 2 attendant movies are settling down into the middle of a larger structure. With the Iliad, we have a text of the 8th century BC coming first. Then come a crowd of 7th century texts treating the events just after those described in the Iliad, the Little Iliad, the Aethiopus, the sack of Troy, the Odyssey and the returns. And then finally describing earlier events, the Kypria from the 6th century. So again, the first text, the Iliad, settles down into the middle of a nest of texts. And this is rather helped by the fact that the Iliad begins only in the 10th year of the conflict. Gilgamesh, we have only the roughest idea of how it was put together. The opening, which we have discussed, at least in part, is rather bourgeois in its preoccupations. Gilgamesh making a mess of the city and interfering with the young, and is therefore the last material to go into the text. And it's very likely that the flood story stationed towards the end of the epic was the first text written, dealing as it does with an ultimate question for every emerging culture. How was it that we cleared away the chaos and wickedness of natural forces to begin the coherent theological story of our origins? Answer, only water. And a large amount of it can perform that dissolving, cleansing task. So just to be clear, most likely the earliest text, the flood, has slid back to, let's call it, the end of the middle. And the hero that we are now interested in, an active civilizer, has supplanted, or rather pre-planted, Utanapishtim and his story. And then the beginning has been added in last. The Bible. We now know a lot about how the Bible was put together. It was previously thought that the Deuteronomistic history was the earliest part, so that stretch of text from the end of Deuteronomy through to Judges, Joshua, Samuel, Kings 1 and Kings 2. Then comes later exilic material, Ezra for instance, and then later material, say, Daniel. And in a sort of staggered belatedness comes the beginning, the so-called priestly texts, which deal with the theologically sensitive matter of origins. The genesis of time for the true believer, the genesis of epic for everyone else. It's a moralizing commentary on other gods and what the community's laws should be. Nowadays, exactly which parts of individual texts are old is better understood, and we'll be looking at one of those in a moment. B, are those middles the authors, the audiences, fundamental preoccupations. In Star Wars, the defeating of an evil, oppressive empire by a diverse group is fundamental. But something else is going on, something fundamental only for later, more sophisticated audiences, namely being smarter than the opposition. A key part of the story is that the intellectual droids have a copy of how the Death Star was built. This is critical for the unrolling of the plot. Also in Star Wars, there is a concentration on the figure of Han Solo, where the audience gets to ponder whether ordinary blokes can participate in aristocratic salvational activities. There is also a heavy focus on right relations between the generations and the idea of the young being able to accede to power. So in summary, the coming to power of an improbable and diverse coalition is the number one preoccupation of a multicultural and multi-interest audience. This is augmented by some special highlighting of the role of technology, democratic participation, and a sort of turbocharged neoteny, a continual highlighting of the young as important. In the Iliad, somewhat intriguingly, the Achaeans can't actually work out a way to defeat the Trojans, and the text seems to dwell on the dysfunctionality of the Achaeans and questions of control versus expression of aggression. The other big factor in the story is the considerable protection of Troy and Trojan fighters that is being afforded by the gods. So the audience's preoccupations are those of the boy's own dream. The treatment of masculine disputes, plenty of old-fashioned killing of the opponents, and the persistent delusion of being given an immoderately hard time by the powers that be. In Gilgamesh, power is attained rather quickly, as we've seen in the first sentence. It's all about power of arms. But the rest of the story rather sharply departs from that and is devoted to the question of how one can live on, if not forever, then for a long time, and the role in doing that of cultivating the favour of the gods. So the central preoccupation in the middle is mortality versus immortality. The Bible, the amalgam of many genres referred to rather curiously as the Bible, is centrally concerned with the entry into Canaan, followed by the entry into and securing of Jerusalem by David. The preoccupation is almost single-mindedly territorial. The audience really never flags in its interest of whether the land of Canaan is divinely and securely held. So in summary on Part 2, Section B, the first text in an epic cycle is a first preoccupation. It's basically always, how did the hero or the hero and his culture come to power? And it always delves into questions of management of aggression and in particular various internal status disputes. C, what happens next? What happens next looks like this. 1, the curse bark, the impulses of raw emotion are expressed beyond some seemingly impregnable fortress. Number 2, curbing of the impulses, moralizing statements of the laws of life. 3, irony. 1 and 2 are not enough for modern life. The individual's agility with forms and content are what is required. The desire to take over and defeat the pre-existing culture becomes hedged around by consequences, by moralizing, by rationalizing with regard to consequences. And these in turn can be superseded by ironic and scientific concerns. In particular, the new impulses to recast the takeover as an ironic enterprise. And this is because irony is as much about taking over the world as any of the unmediated impulses. Irony is just a clever taking over the world by nice, plausible sounding arguments. Discussing how all this works in our target artworks would be way beyond what we can reasonably attempt now, but I want to finish off today by looking closely at one short biblical text to see if we can get a sense of how epic tradition agglomerates in the way I've been outlining. Part 3, the Book of Amos. If about 30 years ago you were asked what the oldest material in the Bible was, i.e. the first material to be written down, you most likely would have said, following Martin Note's famous book of the 1940s, that it was the Deuteronomistic history. So the invasion of Canaan and early kingship. Scholarship on the Bible has, however, moved on quite a bit since then, and now we have a much better sense of the dating of biblical texts. The tendency now is to say, as per the Wikipedia pages, that parts of Psalms, Amos, and Hosea are the earliest written material. Leaving aside stylistic and vocabulary reasons for this ordering, it has often been noted in the archaeological record of ancient texts that lists and the framing of tables come first, and they come long before narratives. So Psalms and Amos, where you have lists, are very likely to contain the oldest written material available to us. And taking Amos as an example of pristine biblical writing, let's see if we can find evidence for our cursing, moralizing, ironizing trajectory. Before launching into this, we had better say something about the peculiarity of prophetic writing in the Bible. The person coming to these texts expecting to get a clear picture of who is saying what in them will be sorely disappointed, because there is a serious and perhaps deliberate clouding of who is speaking in whose voice. And there is a related question. Did the prophet write the text bearing their own name? None of this is resolvable. Because prophets speak in the name of and with the voice of the deity, it is hard to know whether God is speaking or whether the prophet is speaking. The speaking voice occasionally advises you that it is speaking for God, typically with the locution, "Thus says the Lord." Another distinct possibility is that later redactors are doing some or even most of the talking. Notice, for instance, at the beginning of our text, we already don't know why if it is an actual Amos speaking, that he is referring to himself in the third person. I'll just quickly read what the opening says. The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. And he said, "The Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem, and pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers." So, talking in the third person. And if he is referring to himself in the third person, is he at 1:2 that we've just read out, quoting himself, quoting? Also, could it be that God talks about himself in the third person? The Lord roars from Zion, etc. It is unlikely you will ever know the answer to the question of who is speaking in the prophetic text. It could be God, it could be the prophet, it could be the prophet writing, say, his memoirs and thinking of himself as an historical personage, or it could just be a redactor, somebody who is just telling you, the reader, what's happening, or much more likely than all these ideas, just a whole series of redactors. I have spent a long time introducing this because it is relevant to our problem today of what is being embedded in what, and how do you know? And the related matter of when should all the constituent elements be dated? Scholarship thinks there is a pretty clear answer to what is oldest here. I have circled the 4 sections in red, the next oldest in broken line red, and the least old in green. The opening 1:1 and 1:2 are a special problem. So what is so authentically old about 1, 2, 3, 4? 1, 2, 3, 4. Firstly, they deal with old tribal enemies, the Arameans or Syrians in 1, the Philistines in 2, the Ammonites in 3, the Moabites in 4. Secondly, they are highly formulaic and seem to be in a list. And thirdly, the formula seems to be very legalistic and therefore not really from the later period of narratives, i.e. prose writing. So 1, 2, 3, 4 are authentically old. But what are they? Somewhat weirdly, they seem to be legal judgments. Notice the rhetorical nicety of the formula with its sort of double negative, I will not revoke. That is genre answer number 1. Genre answer number 2 is that they are formal war declarations. You have done such and such, and now we, in the person of our God, are coming for you. And notice a war declaration is effectively a curse and says, you should be wiped out or you should be doomed. Scholars seem to like the war declaration idea because the passages are called war oracles. There is, however, another genre possibility, and that is that they are I told you so's. In other words, the bad thing has already happened to Aram, Gaza, Philistia, Ammon, Moab, and these pronouncements are now going into print as retrospective curses, as benefit of hindsight swipes at defeated enemies. The significance of this will become clear very shortly. What seems superficially like a 5th war oracle is the one against Israel, and has to have been written after 722 BC, when Israel is defeated by the Assyrians. This goes on for a bit long for us to be discussing in detail, but notice that it is moving towards being a catalogue of internal or civic sins. It's not actually a war declaration. It has morphed into a much larger cataloguing of social crimes committed and a description of how relentlessly the deity is going to pursue and chastise the wrongdoers. 2:15, he who handles the bow shall not stand, and he who is swift of foot shall not save himself, and so on. Now, Tyre, Edom, and Judah, 6, 7, 8. Notice that these 3 are lacking the final end of quote, says the Lord, which, whilst only a little detail, is the first clue that they don't belong in a first redaction. First Tyre, not really an old tribal enemy. And it seems to have committed exactly the same crime as the Philistines, 9b, 10a, because they delivered up a whole people to Edom. So I will send a fire upon the wall of. So a straight steal of 6b, 7a. There is an opportunistic copycatting going on, and for what is almost certainly a latter-day condemnation of Tyre for its obscenely successful money-making venture of trading in slaves, many of whom would have been people uprooted by the Assyrian wars. And the quotes, covenant of brotherhood, this is a wishy-washy crime based on the idea that Yahweh is the God of all these southeast Mediterranean people. So he is the father of them all. And ergo, all the people in this area are nominally brothers. Now, Edom and Judah, 7 and 8. These have assuredly been added to the war oracles in the time of the exile, i.e. after 586 BC. Judah, because of the very legalistic problem of not obeying the internal laws of Judah, too many to be specified apparently. And Edom, again the brother problem. It is very likely that Edom, the probably very loosely affiliated tribe way down south, beyond the Dead Sea, previously the Midianites, have been moving into the territory of the north occupied by Judah and even Israel, taking advantage of the power vacuum created by the Babylonian exile. So far, we've briefly looked at the blocks of content in Amos, and that will help us out for the greater part of the first 6 chapters, the first 6 of the 9. Now, however, is a good time to introduce a problem that we've simply avoided up to this point. Who is Amos? Since we live in an era where it is thought that people don't live for 200 years, or the 800 years of the patriarchs, then fairly obviously we don't believe that an Amos wrote all his own text. But the further question is, did he write any of it? And in what capacity? A mildly pressing problem for the text is that the Amos of the opening is asserted to be a shepherd. 1:1. How is it that a prophet, a very significant person in society, could be a lowly shepherd? A sneaky, fudging answer to this would be that in the ancient world, a king or a very important figure could be styled a shepherd of the people. The king has to look after his domesticated flock. The trouble with that is that Tekoa, an insignificant town 8 miles south of Jerusalem, would be just where you would expect to find a custodian of animal herds. And moreover, at Amos 7:14b, we are told flatly that Amos is a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. Here we have a fatal blow for the "he's just a metaphorical shepherd" idea. So what's going on? We need to introduce at this point our postulated third part to an epical structure: irony. And the question we need to address is Amos an historical personage, or is he an ironical confection? The straight-out historicity question is fraught with danger, but let's make a few observations. It's pretty clear how the prophecy writing game is played. Curses, warnings, and even legal statements of what crimes deserve which punishments are very probably flying around everywhere in the archaic world. But when someone has an actual misfortune befall them, some group that has been cursed, and all of a sudden, that is a suitable material for going into print. And God can be the author of it because it has come true. Into this general scenario comes vague memories of people who have in the past made castigating warnings to the powers that be, and voila, you have the beginnings of a prophetic text. You have a dim memory of someone who foretold the doom of some group, and then along comes a misfortune for that group. And all of a sudden, retrospectively, that person can now be acclaimed a prophet. So he becomes a prophet prior to never having been. However, an Amos may have been remembered for a very specific reason, but along the lines we have just mentioned, and it is actually given to us in the text. If he had the good fortune to have had his vision and to have predicted the downfall of Aram, the Arameans or Syrians, in the year 764 BC, then he would have definitely been remembered. In 762, an earthquake with its epicenter just to the northwest of Damascus caused great devastation, and damage from it has been found at many archaeological sites throughout Palestine. This would have provided more than enough justification for later writers to pin more and more spectacularly true, after the event, predictions onto this lucky punter. Now, if one can digest all that, it is much easier to see what happens in chapters 7 to 9. At chapter 7, traditional figure Amos is dragged into the text for the first time. Now, we may never know exactly in what circumstances Amos was designated a shepherd from Tekoa at 1:1, but my tip would be an early redacting irony that made his speaking voice a bit more authentic as regular bloke prophet. But what happens at the beginning of chapter 7 is much more blatant. Here the text is transparently ironical. Here Amos is brought in by an era which has become exhausted with denunciations and which needs a new hero to beg for clemency from the deity. An irony-aware hero. So it is that at chapter 7, Amos makes his spectacular entrance into his own text in order to plead in the approved ironic rhetorical fashion with the deity for the condemned Israel and Judah. First, it is the tactic of telling God that Jacob, understand Israel and Judah, are now so small, 7.2b and 7.5b, as a result of his, God's, punishments. And Amos has a couple of minor victories with this. God does some relenting. But this strange interlude is apparently a setup for what happens next. Amos turns up at the Israelite sanctuary at Bethel, making his dire predictions about what will happen to the Israelite power. Notice the shift to storybook mode here. What is the likelihood of this happening? Given what we know about the violent aristocrats of the archaic period, how would this have gone down with the Israelite authorities? They are being told they are all going to die, and by a foreigner and a shepherd, and someone who is completely in their grasp. I'm going to leave you to ponder that likelihood. But my job is to point out the very specifically ironical aspects of this, which are raised up quite a notch with his declaration to the Bethel priest Amaziah, who is arraigning him for his effrontery. I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son. And then the emphatic reassertion of the first irony at the beginning of the book, that he is a mere herdsman. Here we've got the cold evidence of irony. The famous prophet is not a prophet at all. And moreover, doesn't even belong to a prophesying family. Apparently prophecy in early times was a family business. But does Amos's brave intervention, first wrangling with God and then with the Israelite power, bear any enduring fruit? The Israelites just tell him to go back to Judah, and God, who seems to have switched over to speaking for himself, tells Amos his heart is completely hardened against the evil of Israel and Judah, and in fact, more social and cultic crimes are specified. So everything is looking hopeless until 9.8b comes along. And we have the super irony of God's complete volte-face. God just completely and with no explanation changes his mind and declares he will not destroy Israel and Judah after all. And an obvious conclusion is to be drawn. Amos's pleading effected, albeit in some mysterious delayed way, a change of heart. So doom-predicting vehicle for God's wrath, Amos, becomes co-opted by later writers for the ironic purpose of getting God to revoke his punishments. Precisely what he said he would not do. So QED, there is a microcosmic version of the epic cycle in Amos: cursing, moralizing, ironizing, and then a sort of returning to where you started from, where presumably you can start cursing the opponents all over again and getting into trouble with God all over again. Conclusion. In this talk, we attempted two questions. One, what is epic? And two, is it just another genre? I think there are clear answers to both. Let's begin with genres. Genres are just a specific use of literature. Street signs, washing machine manuals, historical romances, etc. They are all selling a format. We can see how that format would change or even be tested with, for instance, clever writers. But each genre serves some single evolutionary purpose. Epic, on the other hand, can't sensibly be seen like this. Whilst it is fundamental to genre, it's not the same as a genre. It's more like what thinking is, or more precisely, what thinking is for a domesticating species. It begins with an unmediated or unvarnished outburst of emotion, like a curse, which, whilst its initial format might be determining for later developments, morphs into a dilation on supervening considerations of a rational kind, of a moralizing kind, of a restricting based on the laws of physics kind. But both the raw expression of emotion plus the attendant moralizing or rational commentary on it are not ever going to be enough. Irony was devised by high civilization to keep a domestic population ready to shift focus in an agile way and to get people to think about topics from the ground up, independent of the baggage of the past. We couldn't speak without the baggage of the past, but it's not our destiny to keep chanting it unmodified. Thanks.